Southern China is home to a variety of imposing landscapes, consisting of beautiful rivers and lakes surrounded by spectacular mountains. Indeed, shanshui, the Chinese word for landscape, literally means mountains' waters. No less a sage than Confucius said,
"The wise take pleasure in waters, while the kind find joy in the mountains."
Landscape, then, reaches up as mountains into the openness of the heavens and settles down as waters onto the firmness of the earth. In between the powers of heaven and earth is where we humans live and die. And when the ancient Chinese thinkers talk of the three worlds, of heaven, humans, and earth, they always understand them as interfused. In the landscape garden, mountains point to heaven in the form of rocks, while waters rest on earth in the shape of ponds. The built structures within the garden stand in for human beings. The main focus here will be on rocks, insofar as stone forms both the general frame and the primary feature of the classical gardens of China. The scenes that follow are from the landscape gardens of Suzhou, near Shanghai. In spite of their importance, rocks are rarely in evidence as one first enters the garden, since the point is to have the garden unfold gradually before the strolling viewer's gaze. Rather, as a Chinese scroll painting is viewed section by section as the scroll is unrolled. The space of the garden is segmented by numerous walls, often combined with walkways, designed to conceal areas that one will only see later. And yet these walls are furnished with windows and doors, which afford partial perspectives in advance on further parts of the garden. For the ancient Chinese thinkers, the overall patterning of unfolding circumstances can never be fully evident. And so the design of the garden declines to offer any panoramic views, but always withholds some things in reserve, which will be revealed only after one has moved on.
Chinese culture is renowned for its reverence for mountains, as exemplified in the 5 great mountains in the Taoist tradition and the 4 sacred mountains in Buddhism.
Mountains are revered by the Chinese as the most spectacular manifestations of the powerful telluric energies that thrust the earth thousands of meters up into the heavens. According to the correlative thinking that informs much of Chinese philosophy, rocks are understood as the equivalent of mountains on a smaller scale. This is not so much because some rocks look like mountains, but rather because rocks are regarded as similar, smaller configurations of the cosmic energies known as qi. The world's first handbook on the aesthetics of natural, unworked stone is the 12th century treatise by Du Wan, The Cloud Forest Catalogue of Rocks. The introduction states the nature of rock and affirms its powers as miniature.
The purest energy of the heaven-earth world coalesces into rock. Its formations are wonderful and fantastic. Within the size of a fist can be assembled the beauty of 1,000 cliffs.
Ji Cheng, author of the well-known garden manual from the 17th century, The Craft of Gardens, writes as follows.
The most important thing for the garden maker is to learn the inner principles of arranging rocks. Whereas the temperament of flowers and trees is easy to grasp, the inner significance of mountains and forests requires profound study. If you have the real thing within you when you make the imitation that you make will become real.
If one approaches the rocks in a Chinese landscape garden from the assumption that they consist of inanimate matter, their power and attraction can hardly be appreciated. The Chinese, rather, see and understand them as especially dense and slow-moving configurations of energy known as qi, as condensed focuses of the forces that drive all of what we call the physical universe. The rock is thus an event rather than a thing, and one that plays out on a vastly extended timescale. Much of the stone to be found in China is, after all, very old indeed. When rocks are appropriately placed in the field of energies that is the well-designed garden, their qi effect is greatly intensified. As Ji Cheng puts it,
Rocks are not like plants or trees. After they have been collected and set in a garden, they gain a new lease on life. Build up a cliff face against an inside wall. Build up a cliff face against an inside wall, and perhaps plant some flowering shrubs or hanging creepers on top. You can thereby achieve the effect of vast distance.
thanks to China's vast size and geological diversity, many types of stone are to be found there. But the kind most prized for garden making came to be the Taihu, or Great Lake Rock, named after a huge lake west of Shanghai, which covers limestone deposits that are over 300 million years old. The nearby city of Suzhou, known as the Venice of the Orient because of its canals, is home to some of China's most beautiful gardens, in part thanks to its proximity to the source of the famous Great Lake rocks. The earliest description we have of a Great Lake rock, which became the most highly prized kind in China during the Tang dynasty, comes from the poet Bai Zhuyi, who flourished in the early 9th century.
Its controlling spirit overpowers the bamboo and trees. Its manifested energy dominates the pavilions and terrace. From its interior rise quiet whispers. Is it the womb of the winds? Sharp swords show in its angular edges, their ringing resonance clearer than jasper chimes. Its great shape seems to move. its massive forces seem on the brink of collapse.
And, as Ji Cheng describes them,
from ancient times, the rocks from the Great Lake have been the most famous. But since they have also been collected from ancient times to the present, they are nowadays not easy to come by. The striations of the rock formation run crisscross over them or swirl around them, rising and falling. There are pits and hollows all over the surface of the stone, which are formed by the action of wind and waves, and are known as bullet holes.
after many centuries of rock connoisseurship, the beauty of Great Lake rocks came to be judged by four main criteria, designated by the conveniently rhyming terms shou, zhou, lo, and to. Shou means something like leanness, suggesting that a slender rock is better than a plump one, but also that there should be no unnecessary excrescences, so that the shape displays the configuration of qi energies that form the stone. Zhou refers to a rich surface texture, consisting of wrinkles and other patterns. Again, the idea is that one should be able to read from the surface of the rock the kinds of energies that formed it. Lo means channels and indentations which induce the eye to move within and around the stone in multiple ways and various rhythms. To refers to a foraminate structure with holes and gaps. To the Chinese sensibility, a rock that is 100% present is perhaps a little too obvious, while one that is only 75% there is much more interesting. There is no doubt some influence here from Taoism, according to which the world results from an interplay of something and nothing, absence and presence, fullness and emptiness. A famous passage in the Taoist classic known as the Tao Te Ching and attributed to Lao Tzu uses the example of the round hole at the center of a cartwheel to draw attention to the way an absence within presence can make something useful. The passage from the Lao Tzu mentioned earlier, concerning the interplay of presence and absence, also gives the example of the way a room is usable only as long as there are gaps in its walls in the form of windows and doors. And, whereas a wall in a garden separates two areas of space, a window within it has the effect of connecting them. According to Ji Cheng,
wooden walls should have many window openings so that one can secretly enjoy looking through them into different worlds, as if in a magic flask.
whitewashed walls in Chinese gardens, like many of the older walls in China, are made in such a way that they gradually acquire a certain patina as they age, as a result of exposure to water and air. They thus become slowly evolving works of visual art. In the Chinese garden, this effect is enhanced by the artful placing of other elements in front of the walls. Ji Cheng writes,
What are known as precipitous mountains are built up against walls, so that the whitewashed surface acts as paper and the rocks as the painting on it. The designer should follow the natural cracks in the stone, imitating the brushwork of the old masters. The rocks should be planted with pines from Huangshan, ancient plum trees, and fine bamboo. Looking at this scene through a round window is just like seeing scenery reflected in a mirror. A mighty rock welcomes the visitor to a magical other world. Fine bamboos play their shadows as if to the music of panpipes over the water.
when vegetation is planted in front of a wall that receives sunshine, the shadows multiply this painterly effect while extending and transforming it as long as the sun's gradual movement remains visible. The Qing dynasty novelist Shanfu discusses the art of garden making at several points in his novel, 6 Records of a Floating Life.
In laying out gardens, one must try to give the feeling of the small in the large and the large in the small, of the real in the illusion and the illusion in the reality. The wall of a small garden should be winding and covered with vines, and large stones decorated with inscriptions should be set into it. Then one is able to open a window and, while looking at a stone wall, feel as if one were gazing out over endless precipices.
According to ancient Chinese thought, if a rock is a microcosm of a mountain, then an appropriately arranged and constructed collection of rocks will form an entire mountain range. Records go back to the 6th century for the practice of piling up rocks into artificial mountains in imperial gardens and parks. Of one garden maker of the time, it was written,
He built up a mountain as if it were a work of nature, with piled up peaks and multiple ranges rising in steep succession, and deep ravines and caverns and gullies tortuously linked.
This practice later spread to the literati, and the artificial mountain became a special feature in the classical scholar's garden, especially in Suzhou and environs. A commentator from the late 17th century writes,
A skillful maker will take pains over the details, so that the scene is not piled up and folded, the rocks are not reversed and turned around, and proportions are harmonious. Thus the natural and spontaneous is not lost in the midst of human craft, and a marginal piece of land preserves the flavor of the wilderness. Eschew a fractured fussiness which is distasteful, as well as a formal order which approaches vulgarity. Do not have an excess that strives after splendor, nor too much cleverness which buries what is real. Thus, people can wander among the rocks for a whole year without wearying.
in Ji Cheng's The Craft of Gardens, there is more discussion of artificial mountains than any other feature of the garden.
As you wander wherever your feet take you, you may doubt that there is any boundary to the place. As you raise your head to gaze around, deep emotions will be stirred within you. The depths of your imagination should be full of images, and your feelings should overflow into valleys and hills.
Finally, according to Ji Cheng,
to have mountains situated beside a pool is the finest sight in a garden. You may set stepping stones in the water or build a flying bridge across from the mountainside. Caves and fissures may be concealed within the mountain, running right through the cliffs or leading down to the water. Never say there are no immortals on earth, for this is a realm of spirits in the world of humans. much.